So 2 stories about giving today. One was a story of a man who was called by his God, Allah, to be generous. And the second describes a person who is simply named as a wise woman who stumbles upon good fortune. Considering my theology, which is rooted in love and interconnectedness, the second story has greater impact for me. It comes from a book called The Trance of Scarcity, Stop Holding Your Breath and Start Living Your Life by Victoria Castle. And her book is what I've used for today's sermon. The man returns the stone, but he wants her to tell him what was within her that made her give it to him in the first place. I've been thinking a lot about generosity lately. I wish I could sit and talk to that wise woman and understand how somebody does something like that. I've been reflecting on my own generosity and that of many of you in the congregation, and I've been thinking about scarcity and fear and abundance and gratitude, big words, big ideas, the restricting emotions, and the ways that we grapple with and try to overcome, and then those generative ways of being that we seek to grow. After all, the very cornerstone of the church community is generosity, the generosity of the founders who purchased a little church building on the corner of East River Road and Mississippi over 56 years ago. The money and the time and the expertise, the extra hands, the love and care over the years, the hours of sweat labor and volunteer time in leadership meetings and guiding worship and life cycle rituals, playing music, the hours of cooking meals and giving rides and sitting at each other's bedsides. What an amazing thing when you really stop to think about it. When you become a part of a church, you are brought into a history of generosity. And this has also been a congregation of frugality, building only when the money was available, selling parcels of land in order to fund an expansion, and staffing with seminarians and part-time ministers up until just a few years ago. This week, when I was away at the Ministerial Institute, we heard from Susan Frederick Gray, who's the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association. She talked about how hard these times are, these liminal times. She used that word we've used many a times. She talked about churches who may, out of uncertainty, feel the need to balance this year's budget and are recommending that they cut staff since staffing makes up the majority of their budget, at least in most of our congregations. And she spoke about how boards and congregations dread the thought of running a deficit. We have heard these words. What I thought was interesting, and it really struck me, was she talked about churches being perpetual institutions. They're ones that have existed in the past and they will do so well into the future. Perpetual institutions, she said, find their way through hard times for the sake of the future. I heard her as describing a need to hold steady in this time of uncertainty, to see what the future holds. Man, we all come with our own history of money. We come with our past made up of different social economic realities. Many of us have come from backgrounds where there was little to spare, where we relied on the kindness of strangers to help provide food and hand-me-downs, and even sometimes to help pay bills. Other of us had more of a middle or upper class backgrounds where we were able to live comfortably in our homes and shop for new clothes at the beginning of a school year. We were able to travel or get additional education without decades of debt. I remember being at a fundraising class many years ago when I worked for a nonprofit, and the woman who led the class asked us a question about generosity across income levels. I believe she was speaking specifically about donations to churches, and the researchers found that the people who have less gave proportionately more than those who had plenty. Those who were in lower socioeconomic classes gave proportionally more than those who were in the middle or upper classes. We can see this in our own tradition. Although Unitarian Universalists have a large proportion of financially secure members, we give less than our counterparts in other faith traditions. Maybe it's because we weren't taught that God or Allah expects us to give. We have no accountability built into our theology that says we will have a day of reckoning when we die. If I'm honest, I believe that what keeps me from giving more generously across the board is my own inner dialogue. I've been noticing lately that there are times when I read like a GoFundMe story through a friend, or I hear about a local organization doing good work or that's in need. I hear the ask to give to one of our community partners, and my heart says, give! And then, almost immediately, something in my head stops me. It's like either the sheer laziness of pulling out a credit card or my wallet. Sometimes it's feeling that I can't give without talking it over with Linda first, since it's our money and not really my money, even though I know she wouldn't mind. Sometimes it's thinking I'm going to give, that what I'm going to give isn't really enough. It doesn't really matter because it's not substantial enough. So I choose not to give, or else I think, what if I give too many gifts to too many places and then it doesn't have enough of an impact? Can you see like where this dialogue is going in my mind? I don't know what you guys say that keeps you from holding back from that initial give, but I trust that you have your own as well. Somehow, many years ago, Linda and I were convinced to up our pledge at Unity Church Unitarian. Somebody must have come over and just hit our heartstrings at the right moment. That amount has become the baseline that we now evaluate what we give annually to MSUS. I'd say, is it as much as we can give? If I'm honest, I would say no, but it's a good amount, and when I see it, I feel proud. Victoria Castle says that generosity is more than a single act. She said, once you embody abundance as your way of being, you can't help being more inspired and more inspiring. You'll build bridges to replace dead ends, and you'll easily arise at solutions to issues that used to overwhelm you. This life-giving generosity is counter to what she calls the trance of scarcity. I love that name. It's a good thing for me to remember. I find that language of the trance of scarcity helpful. When I think of being in the trance, I imagine myself like blocked off from what's going on around me. I think of moving in the world without noticing or paying attention, without emotion, without connection. Simply going through the motion with a sense of kind of automatic numbness. That's what a trance feels like to me. Castle's research on the trance of scarcity revealed to her an element of our existence, a way of being that is most often invisible to us. Yet, like so many things in our life that can go unquestioned, scarcity is like in the air we breathe. She says we catch it like a virus as we move within our culture and our familiar surroundings. She said it's proven itself as a pandemic. In individuals, communities, organizations, systems, and governments, it's become institutionalized and accepted without question. Learning to free ourselves is both a personal and a planetary issue if we are to create the future where we can all thrive. So she points specifically to two phrases that echo in many people's minds. One is about the self, and the other is about just what is. The first is I am not enough. And she says, like, I'm not good enough, smart enough, rich enough, young enough, old enough, worthy enough. Those kind of phrases that go through our minds, sometimes without even really noticing it. And then there's the companion, which is there is not enough. There's not enough time, money, opportunity, love, cooperation, power, you name it. This prevailing premise, she says, of not enoughness successfully slows down the lives of people who would otherwise be buoyant and passionate. And she continues, since its subjects are so readily yet unwittingly loyal to it, she calls it that trance of scarcity. I always think it's good to like stop for a moment and pay attention to what, we've taken in, because it happens so subtly in our lives. I think particularly when we think about in this capitalistic world where we're all so busy, that a not enoughness can be very real. So here at Michael Servetus, we talk about spiritual practices that can help ground us and remind us of our interconnectedness and expand our hearts and our spirits. And we share our own experiences and practices that can help us breathe in peace and breathe out love so we can be our best selves with one another and for the planet. Castle says, what we embody becomes a way of being. It influences every part of it, every part of us. Our way of being in the world is the result of what we practice, whether or not it is intentional. Although Castle's book was written quite some time ago, it echoes today's reality. She says, at this point in history, the majority of people throughout the world feel disempowered and exhausted. It doesn't make for a very bright future, does it? We know all too well what life looks like inside the trance of scarcity. The evidence is everywhere we turn. The time is right to see what life is like for you to live in freedom from the trance. Fulfilled people, those who have ready access to their greatness and aliveness, are resourceful and they're generous, they're resilient and peacemaking folk. A world full of such people has a very different future than the one we face now. Each one of us holds a piece of the larger solution. Each one of us plays a part by making a contribution that is ours alone to make, the one that we're itching to bring forth. That is where the real fun is. So I am particularly interested in the spirit of generosity, that feeling inside that says yes, that reminder to slow down and see one another as beloved, even in times when our weary instincts are welcoming in our less than generous selves. I'm curious about why it's so easy to let negativity and scarcity in, those constraining emotions and ways of thinking, when I know that my whole being feels better when I invite in generosity. Castle would categorize this smaller, constraining behavior as not enough thinking. This is thinking that keeps us in survival mode. Beth, I always think of you when I talk of our reptilian brain on constant alert, scanning for threats, preparing for attack or defend. Not enough thinking, it preempts our higher brain functions, the ones that inspire us to innovate and cooperate. Geez, one would think that after all this time, we humans would be more evolved than that. So imagine this voice of scarcity and protection as a trickster, showing up in our lives and tricking us into complacency. As the years go by, it becomes all that we know. Castle says we've spent years designing our entire lives according to what we believe is real. Our belief in scarcity shows up in our bodies as a lack of aliveness, and in our lives as we experience lack and limitation. What annoying L words, lack and limitation. This, she said, is where the mischief begins. We're not always great at assessing what's real and what isn't. See if any of these statements sound familiar. I'm not enough. There's never enough to go around. It's so hard. Nothing comes easy. That'll never work. Most of us have been repeating these statements or statements such as these to ourselves for decades, and as far as we know, they can accurately describe reality. Really, though, they're just ideas. Richard Bach says, argue for your limitations, and they're yours. Just argue for your limitations, and they're yours. So I came from San Diego, where over 100 Unitarian Universalist ministers gathered in person last week, and several hundred gathered online. The weariness and the exhaustion of this liminality and the unknown are real. years of being online, or for those with spaces which allowed indoor gatherings, years of saying yes to gather in person, followed by no, have worn us all out. Families, so many families and congregations have not been able to engage. All have people who have not engaged online, whose status with the future of their congregation remains unknown. The well, that well feels mighty dry. And yet, time goes on. And for those of us who have chosen Unitarian Universalist congregations as their church home, that centrality of existence continues to call us into this holy endeavor of building a beloved community. So I find myself fluctuating a little bit between the doomsday scenario it's simple to kind of more of a simple acceptance, and then an unexpected energy in imagining what's next for us. I know that we know that the doomsday scenario is not really helpful. It has us planning for a future based on scarcity and fear, based on all that could go wrong, what might not thrive, and on our limitations. And even saying those words kind of constricts my heart, and it leaves a knot in my stomach. I can't imagine being or moving forward with that occupying my body and my heart and my spirit, and I doubt you can either. Castle understands that the stories we tell ourselves are powerful. So if we tell ourselves a doomsday story, that is the energy we invite in. She shared a story about how we as humans tend to spin this larger story and emotion around incidents that could actually just be seen as neutral. I loved as she talked about her younger self and that she was at this dance and talking to this young man, and at the end of the dance he said, "I'll call you." And she went home. Next day he didn't call. Day after he didn't call. Actually, the whole week passed, and this guy who said, "I'll call you," did not call. So she went to her older brother's room for a little bit of wisdom, talk it through with a guy. And she said, "He told me he was going to call me. He didn't. What do you think it means?" And he said, "It means he didn't call." That's it. He just didn't call. Her brother didn't attach emotions or rationalizations. It was just a fact. It just was, period. I kind of felt liberated by this example. I tend to take incidents and then I like to wrap them up in a larger story. And as you may have guessed by this example, the larger stories tend to point fault at me or at us as a congregation when a family chooses to no longer attend MSUS, yet it's evident on their Facebook page that they're thriving. Does it mean that they chose to focus their time and commitments elsewhere, or does it mean we failed? If we prepare an adult education program and no one comes, that does it mean it was a bad subject that no one is interested in? Or do people forget, or have other obligations that night, or have other ideas occupying their minds? It is really easy to construct a story that is far from neutral and that's self-effacing. And such stories feed into a trance of scarcity and they destroy generativity and joy. We are really in an extraordinary time now at Michael Servetus Unitarian Society. In less than 3 weeks, we will have said goodbye to Oakley Avenue, our Oakley Avenue home. I've learned that it's important to tell people the why behind the sale of the building, because otherwise people think of it as a sign of our demise. Scarcity and fear rules out there, folks. When I point to the decisions we've made together over time and the clarity around wanting to be a radically hospitable congregation, the story shifts drastically. Our decision to sell becomes one of letting go so that we can say yes to our shared future. It becomes a story where creativity and curiosity stir deep within as we come to understand who we are as our present congregation and how we can live into the future. So I want us to ask generative questions. I want us to tap into our creativity and our love and our care. I want us to understand who we are and what we have to offer beyond our walls and to live into that. I want us to foster generosity of all kinds, of our time, of our way of being with one another, our financial giving, and of our stories. This congregation is one that has been significantly contributing to people's lives for over 55 years. Some remain and some have gone. Although so much around us has changed, we have made a bold move in selling our building, and so much remains constant in the ways that we long to lead purposeful lives. The mission of this community of all ages is to celebrate and actively examine faith and to challenge one another with loving kindness to be our best selves and work for a flourishing world. Our mission is only possible if we open ourselves to it. We know the importance of stories, those we tell others and those we tell ourselves. Castle says that stories of scarcity will surely defeat our purpose. She tells us we can trade them for stories that bring your creativity, aliveness, and joy into full play. So let's take this moment and the moments that follow and open the door to creativity, aliveness, and joy, because it's from that place that we will all grow and thrive. May it be so. So I'm curious about all of you, how you're holding this time, how you hold your own generosity. Are there times where you've done that, yes, and then automatically shut the door to that yes? Have you caught yourself in that trance of scarcity? And what is this time in your life calling to you in terms of generosity? We have a few minutes, not a lot, but if anybody has anything they'd like to share, I hear somebody's phone ringing somewhere. Please feel free to come up or raise your hand if you're shy, and Chad will bring you a microphone. Or Diana, if you see anybody there, feel free to call on them.
Right, so far I'm seeing nodding, but nobody raising their hand yet. Lynn.
Thank you, Laura. That was incredibly helpful. What takes me into the trance of scarcity is often worrying about the future and imagining terrible things that can happen. And I have to stop and remember that that's just fiction. And I can make up terrible stories, or I can make up really inspiring stories, and they are equally true, but I'd rather work on making the inspiring ones happen. So I try to stop myself when I get into that future worry.
I'm Katie Johnson. Generosity is one of my favorite topics. But what I find really interesting is that we were well into the pandemic before I realized that one of the things that was really impacting me was the loss of my own generosity. So I found myself feeling, it's a bodily reaction. I can feel very much constricted, and in fact felt lighter just listening to some of your words today. The other thing that I find really interesting is, there is science behind this. So for anybody who doesn't want to pay attention to the feelings part, that we are happier if we spend money on someone else than on ourselves. And this isn't to say that we're not supposed to spend money on ourselves for our own well-being and give everything away, but we are demonstrably happier if we buy a coffee for someone else rather than spending it on ourselves. And I find that also really interesting.
Thanks, Katie. You've inspired me around generosity many times, and I think it's so fascinating that we have to keep reminding ourselves, like, why that isn't the central story. I do not understand. But I think it's a worthy story to combat or to rewrite. As Lynn says, you can feed either one. It's much more enjoyable, and there are much more possibilities there if we feed the positive one. Anybody else on that? On the
Janice, did I
screen?
see you moving your microphone to get ready to speak? No, okay. She says no. I don't see anybody else, but if I'm missing you, please do unmute and speak. And there's nothing in chat.
That's fine. So our closing hymn is 218. This 118. It's amazing how a little number can make a difference. This little light of mine, and just like before, we're going to have the hymn leaders up here. People at home will be muted and can sing along. Those of us who are here, unfortunately, have to hum along. I assure you, when it's safe to sing again, we will. I chose this song so we can all be reminded of the power and the joy of our own light within. May we choose to let it shine.